Okay, thank you very much. All right, I now welcome the Special Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism, Ms Jillian Segal AO, via video conference. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to parliamentary committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Jillian Segal, Special Envoy to Combat Anti-Semitism.
I'll now invite you to make an opening statement, and then at the conclusion of that we'll open up for discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Chairman and Committee, for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. And could I also acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land in which we are meeting, albeit virtually. I thought I might outline 3 areas to update you on the work that I have been doing since the Senate report. Can I just note, though, that you have my submission to the Senate committee and that you will take that into account, because those recommendations in Appendix 5 of my submission to the Senate committee are still ongoing recommendations of my office, although I note that one has already been achieved in terms of the government extending the terms of reference of the National Student Ombudsman, for which I'm very grateful. I have taken the findings of the Senate report very much to heart, and have been focusing my time since then on working with universities on complaint schemes and on a definition of anti-Semitism and on training materials. So I thought those would be useful 3 areas that I could update you on. But let me just reiterate, because I have had the opportunity of listening to the ECAJ and ZFA and to AUGUS. And can I just say as an aside how very proud I am of those AUGUS students, because I thought they expressed themselves and these Jewish students that they represented extremely professionally. As I noted in my Senate committee submission, and as you recall, I based that on a range of interviews that I had with Jewish students and academics, anti-Semitism, I believe, has become an embedded part of the culture of universities. And I did note the question earlier from the Deputy Chair as to whether universities were a cauldron of anti-Semitism. I think that they have been, and they are, but I think they are always going to be places of strong discussion, as they should be, because they're also a cauldron of expression of free speech. And what we have to do very much, as AUGUS noted, is turn them back into those places of respectful debate and change the culture back to the culture that it should be, or that perhaps it was. Although it is, in my opinion, on some campuses systemic. It's not necessarily on every campus, and what we have to do is work on those where there are issues. So those universities where it is normalised and debate is really not civil, have eaten away at the fabric of our society. And just to emphasise, it's not just affecting Jewish students in the Jewish community, but it is a risk to the next generation of our leaders in society and our democratic way of life. So I have, as the Senate recommended, continued to work with universities to try to address some of these failings, and have met with them numerous times, together with TEXA and individually. And I'm pleased to report that I believe we have made some progress. And I have principally met with the Vice-Chancellors of the GO8, but by no means only, and I have worked with University Australia and met with a subcommittee of other universities, or representing all the universities, to also bring them up to date with the work and take them on the same journey. And I'm going to outline the work and where we've got to, but could I just say this, that in outlining this work, I do not want to give you the impression that the work is done. We must, as a community and as a government and Parliament, not take our foot off the accelerator, because time is very limited to change the circumstances for Jewish students in particular for the start of next calendar year or next academic year. So I want to give you a tiny bit of hope that we have made progress, but by no means should the matters raised in my series of recommendations not be fully endorsed. So since then, or certainly even just before the Senate report, but I think during the announcement of the Senate hearings, many universities have reviewed their frameworks and policies, particularly in relation to encampments and occupation of buildings. And I have asked all universities to send their policies into my office. I have received all of them, and I have not yet undertaken a full review of all those policies, but that will happen before the end of the year. It is my expectation that there are some very good policies, and perhaps, and those policies have been amended post October 7, and there are some that are not. And it's my intention to put out a sort of pro forma or have a discussion with all universities on good policies or best practice policies. And of course, they have to be individualised depending on the structure of the university and the functions. But generally, there will be key provisions in there. I don't believe that there will be a lot of resistance to amending policies to achieve best practice. And you would have seen in Bruce Hodgkinson's report of the University of Sydney that he also looks at the importance of ensuring that encampments are dealt with differently, that students do not occupy buildings, etc., etc. The second area is in relation to complaint procedures. And as part of having an effective complaint procedure, which the universities have not generally had, and you would have heard, I know, from Vicky Thompson from the GO8 and Luke Shear from Universities Australia, and unfortunately I was not able to hear what they said. But I established a working group from the GO8 to look at a definition of anti-Semitism, because you can't have an effective complaint scheme without a definition. And you have to then have those within the complaint scheme trained in relation to dealing with complaints and the definition, and then have the definition integrated into your disciplinary proceedings, whatever they are. And each university will have their own. So the fact that universities generally had not adopted almost across the board a definition of anti-Semitism, I think, was stark evidence of the fact that they didn't have effective complaint schemes. And as my evidence before the Senate and my submission showed, of the 65 people I interviewed, maybe 55 students, not one had had their complaints properly dealt with or effectively dealt with in their view. So the issue of the definition of anti-Semitism is a fraught one. I endorse the IRA definition of anti-Semitism as the gold standard. And I've heard the recommendations of ECAJ and the ZFA and indeed AUGUS that that is the definition that should be adopted. And it is the internationally accepted definition adopted by the government and the opposition and by 45 other countries, the European Commission, hundreds of tertiary institutions around the world, etc. We are unfortunately in a difficult situation in Australia where many universities, in response to a letter from the previous government encouraging all universities to adopt the IRA definition, took the IRA definition through their academic boards. And academic boards are by definition made up of the academics in the university. And in most cases, those boards rejected the definition, specifically rejected them. It's not as if they haven't thought about it, that there was strong debate and that definition has been rejected. And I have worked with the universities before I was appointed envoy and certainly since, and that definition is just not, in my opinion, going to easily fly with universities. It will take the government to pass legislation to actually embed that definition as the definition that applies throughout society and that universities need to adopt, I believe, before many universities will adopt that definition. Of course, Melbourne University has, and Monash and UNSW have referenced it in their definitions. And as you've heard from the Jewish representatives from the ECAJ, this rejection of IRA is misguided and misunderstands the working examples in relation to Israel. And as ECAJ referenced, the Canadian envoy has put out a very useful handbook which explains this. and I'm more than happy to pick up the suggestion to produce one here. But I do not think it is going to necessarily convince universities and their academic boards to adopt that definition. And I have spoken to these vice-chancellors, certainly to the G08 ones, and asked them if the definition could be adopted by the councils rather than the academic boards. And they all want them to go through the academic boards because, and I have sympathy with this argument, they need them to be owned by the university. I mean, there's no use just having a definition and saying tick. It's actually got to be a working definition, integrated into complaints, integrated into policies, integrated into discipline, and therefore each university has to own this definition. So I have been working with the G08 initially, but also, as I said, with this subcommittee of Universities Australia, to see if we can come up with an acceptable, shortened, Australianised, universityised IRA version. So our Australian IRA, where the essence of IRA is in the definition, is much shorter, it doesn't have the case studies, and it deals specifically, obviously, with anti-Semitism. We're not talking about anything more general because, as I've said before, anti-Semitism is this unique hatred with its own long history and its own issues, and the definition must be a definition that covers behaviour, covers Israel, and covers Zionism, but obviously not to the extent of the detail of IRA. So we have been working very intently on this for weeks and weeks, and I have to say that the universities that I've been meeting with, and that's the G08, and they've each got a representative on this committee, have done so with much goodwill and good intent and strong effort. I think we are close, but we are not there yet. So we have committed to continue working on it together to see if we can come up with a definition before the end of the year. That is my deadline. I think, I know it is not IRA, but the advantage of the Australian version for universities of IRA, as I put it, is that I believe it would then be owned by the universities and it would be integrated into their policies and their procedures and wouldn't just be a tick and then a definition in a drawer. They would make it part of their disciplinary proceedings and their issues. Now, it follows, although IRA is the definition recommended in the global guidelines, to which Australia is also a signatory. When I went to Buenos Aires, that's where those were signed. US universities such as Columbia and NYU and Harvard have gone down this path of creating their own definition, their own working definition. What I'm trying to do here, and the only way I would agree to this, and I mean, in a sense, I'm just giving them the imprimatur, it's the universities adopting this definition, is there would be one definition for the entire sector. So you would not have different universities creating different definitions. They would all adopt this one definition. But whether we get there or not, I suppose depends on both their intent and hopefully your encouragement that it is absolutely essential that one be agreed, and that they need to then revise and strengthen their complaint processes and ensure that complaints are not only appropriately resolved, but also, as you've heard from ECAJ and ZFA and August, that the resolution of complaints needs to be made public, albeit in a de-identified way, so that you can change the culture, because this is what has to happen. The community at university needs to know what are the boundaries of acceptable and unacceptable behaviour, and they can only know that from resolutions that are made public. And so that publication of a de-identified list of complaints, I think, is a very important recommendation. And that report should be delivered to TEXA and to my office, I think, every year. Leadership from university chancellors is also extremely important to change the culture, and they need to speak out more and repeatedly, which is one of the injunctions in the global guidelines. The last matter I will address you on is in relation to training. You've heard a lot about the importance of training. I have been speaking to these universities, all of the universities, about training. There is an acceptance, I believe, that there should be training about anti-Semitism, both for their complaint schemes, personnel and their leadership. Monash University has taken the lead here by developing some modules for training, which is very generous of Monash University because they've footed the bill. I have seen an outline of these modules, and they are going to be trialled next week around Monash University. And then they will get feedback from students, Jewish students and other students, as well as academics, and they'll be iterated again and again until that use next academic year. And if it is seen to be fit for purpose, the other GO8 and the other universities have indicated to me they would roll out the same training. We may have a second set of training modules. Both the Auschwitz Institute, which sends out training around the world for police forces, and others have offered to adapt their training for universities at my request. And Yad Vashem, the chairman who was recently out here, has also offered their training modules. It's important that the modules, these are not Holocaust modules, they are about anti-Semitism and using some of the case studies of complaints as their basis. So I think we are on track, but the foot should not come off the accelerator, or both feet should be on the accelerator, if I might say. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Segal. Leading on from your opening statement, I mean, obviously there is significant work that's going on right now. And while the judicial inquiry does remain at the top of your recommendations to the Senate inquiry, which you maintain, I mean, how important is it that there are steps taken in the short term that a judicial inquiry would take some time, and not discounting the importance of that recommendation? How important is it also to have practical improvements in things such as definitions, complaint processes, university attitudes, ready for students to be at university next year?
Oh, absolutely, Chair. It's essential. And that's why we've got on with the business of working on this together. And I indicated as much, I think, in my testimony before the Senate. Judicial inquiry obviously has great advantages in terms of changing culture and revealing a number of issues, allowing students to share their stories confidentially, and also funding issues. But that's not going to happen anytime soon. So what happens in the new year, etc., might be completely unknown in my perspective. That's why I've got on with the work. And I think it's essential. And I have had the GO8 at least admit, as well as other universities, say what they want to do is have a different landscape to the extent they can for Jewish students next year. Everybody's very concerned that Jewish students might not elect to go to university in Australia next year. They might take the year off because it's been so bad, or decide to go overseas. So it's very important that that doesn't happen, and that there is enough communication made by vice-chancellors about what they're doing for next year to encourage Jewish students to come back onto campus.
I mean, on that, there does seem to be some momentum and some shift. Even the University of Sydney had the Hodgkinson Review, where the Vice-Chancellor, even this morning, seemed to take a positive tone towards that review, and that the Senate of that university had basically charged him with implementing those recommendations. Yet, many of those recommendations are not brand new. These are things that have been around for a while. I mean, what do you think is the turning point in universities at the moment? I mean, is it the fact that there was a Senate inquiry, there's now a Parliamentary Joint Committee into Human Rights inquiry, there's calls for a judicial inquiry? I mean, is it the fact that there is spotlight on the universities that they are more conscientious of this, or why do you think there is an improvement of attitude?
Yes, Well, I think it's a combination of factors. I think that the Senate was a very valuable exercise, having that inquiry and actually, requiring vice-chancellors to give evidence and understanding. I think that in large organisations, and some of these universities are extremely large, they're little cities, it is the case that bad news doesn't travel up easily. The vice-chancellors get protected by a range of people, and perhaps they didn't genuinely recognise it was as bad as it was, and a lot of that evidence had to come out, and the additional people that I met with, etc. I think that, I don't think we're dealing in terms of vice-chancellors at any of these universities with bad people who are personally, racist, but they have been managing a lot of issues. And this issue did not bubble to the surface with enough seriousness and urgency, and I think it now has. That doesn't mean that cultural change is going to happen overnight, and that is the problem. As you've heard, I think the problems have been going on for some time. Representatives of the Jewish community have been raising issues and concerns for some time. It didn't just start after October 7, but they haven't taken them seriously enough. And I think what they haven't appreciated is that anti-Semitism is a particular and unique form of hatred. It's not just general racism that can be dealt with by, feel-good racism policies. It needs to be dealt with by itself. It needs to have a specific definition, and people need to be trained to understand how it can operate, how people feel, and how to resolve complaints and make them public as well. So I think that's a cultural shift. And I think that there has been movement generally. Some universities have responded really well post October 7, and some took a lot of time. I think those universities with encampments have been the most problematic, by definition. They were the campuses where there was perhaps the most distress towards Jewish students exhibited, or behaviours and environments that caused distress to the Jewish students. But I think that the fact that all those encampments have gone have allowed the focus now to be on, how do we prevent that happening again? How do we change the environment, and how do we change the culture? Now, that is not going to happen overnight. They need to do a lot of things, and as I said, they need a lot of ongoing encouragement. But I do think there's movement.
I'm very conscious of time, and we're about to eat into lunch, but I do want your opinion on just a couple more things. On the definition, how are you encouraging universities to think around the delineation between legitimate criticism or acceptable or appropriate criticism of the Israeli government and the threshold of it descending into anti-Semitism in terms of your definition that you're suggesting, the sort of Australian version of the IRA definition? How are you encouraging universities to make that delineation?
Well, Chair, as that is that's the essence of the most difficult bit of the definition. Okay, and I think that there's an absolute recognition that freedom of speech has limitations, and as the report from Bruce Hodgkinson noted, even the French Code itself, where universities previously sort of heralded that as the be-all and end-all, it had its own articulated limits on freedom of speech. And you can't shout others down, and you can't have negative speech against a group of people. And so that is what we are trying to ensure goes in the definition. And I think Peter Wertheim articulated it earlier. Of course, you can criticise Israel as any other country, but where the criticism of Israel descends into calls for its elimination or the elimination of all Jews within it, then that clearly crosses the line. The issue that is a difficult one is where there are double standards applied, which fall short of calling for the elimination, but they certainly hold Israel to a standard you not holding other countries to. And that is where I think Bruce Hodgkinson is very wise to remind us that it does depend on context. Not everything can be absolutely crystal clear in a definition. You have to look at context. And that will be very important in the training materials, that one has to look at context. And so we are hoping that we can put a bit of contextual language around the definition without having a series of case studies within the definition, as IRA does, because those case studies have, according to the universities, made it very clunky to incorporate that. And we try and have a shorter definition, but at least identify the issue very clearly, where Israel is definitely criticised in a way that is anti-Semitic, where it is not, and then where it has to be looked at in terms of context.
Last question around transparency of university complaint processes and around giving students and staff more confidence. Is there any other advice? I mean, there's a couple of recommendations that go to it, but is there any advice that you wish to give to the committee around how universities could give students and staff more confidence when going through complaints?
Yeah. Well, I think the idea of making sure that there is Vice Chancellor, the head of the complaint scheme should sit down with Vice Chancellors every month and take the Vice Chancellor through the complaints. That's important governance, and it will be a way to ensure that people know that the Vice Chancellor is aware. There should be reports about, in a identified way, as mentioned, about the complaints and how they were resolved. Okay, it is not just a matter of saying that student was satisfied, but what discipline was applied so that it becomes a learning experience of the boundaries. And that those reports should come to TEXA and to my office. They shouldn't just be made internally. There should be a transparency, and we should see that the universities are lodging those reports. I think that's going to help give confidence. And I do think that Vice Chancellors have to continue very close communication with Jewish students, whether it's not just with August, but with Jewish students more generally. Speak up about what is happening, speak up about what they're doing. Confidence is going to come from an absolute focus on this and a demonstrated change in culture.
Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Special Envoy, for the work you've been doing in this area. I think it's pretty well established what you're doing and the impact it's having, so I don't have a lot of questions. I just wanted to pick up a point that you raised in the Senate hearing, where you noted that you're concerned that the university hierarchy do not appreciate the extent of the difficulty before them. I'm hoping that it's dawning on them now, but also that they don't appreciate the extent of the embedded anti-Semitism on campus. Yeah. I get the sense from the Vice-Chancellors we spoke to this morning that they seem to think that this is a transient problem, where students are outsiders who are creating the problem and, they come and go. My fear is that anti-Semitism is embedded within the staff and the academics of these universities. What has your work so far uncovered in relation to being embedded not within the student body but within the actual institution itself, the staff and the academics?
Thank you so much for that question, which I think it gets to the heart of the problem. It's a very perceptive question. I have not done any work as yet with the universities in relation to their academics. I think that is where there is embedded anti-Semitism, and the detailed complaints that I heard, there were complaints that related, of course, to the encampments and to the student experience with posters and other students, etc. But the real discriminatory complaints, if I could put it that way, were related to academics. And the fact that there are a large number of academics in some of these universities have taken advantage of opportunities, of intranet sites, of the fact that even if you're a student in medicine, you have to log on to a site to put their positions, to not enable students to argue against them, to take it out on students in terms of grades, if they don't subscribe to that academic's anti-Semitic view. And it's not anti-Semitic per se against the student, but it's all linked to Israel and whether that student supports Israel or doesn't support Israel, and that is seen, which is why the move into Zionism has been, the area where I think most students have felt intimidated and concerned. And that is the problem. And so having a definition and having complaint schemes and then, Vice-Chancellors knowing about it is only the beginning of the journey. It's certainly not the end of the journey. What needs to be looked at is then those academics who are crossing the line and what is done about them. And that's where the Hodgkinson Review does make a few suggestions and where Vice-Chancellors have to say, OK, that is not just a question of free speech. That is not just a question of academic freedom. And that is just not what this university stands for. We were not going to have our academics only allow speakers to come in on campus who represent one point of view, not going to only allow one point of view in any courses and any lectures. We have to look at the broader spectrum of discussion and debate because there lies the future of our democracy. I mean, if those academics who hold a sort of one-sided view of Israel and Jews are allowed to dominate, that will destroy our democracy.
I completely agree. That's all from me. Thanks, Chair.
Ms. Tink.
Thank you so much for your time this afternoon, Special Envoy. It's fantastic to hear from you. Picking up on something you just said, and actually it wasn't a question I was going to put to you, but I would like to understand further the comment you just made. So in front of me I have a quote from the Director of the Australian Centre for Jewish Civilisation at Monash University, David Sluky.
Yep.
And you may be aware of him and the work he's done, but he makes the point that actually anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are distinct, but there is a capacity for one to bleed into the other. So his comment was that anti-Semitism is a hatred of Jews that can be manifested through speech, through action and through intimidation. Anti-Zionism is, as the name suggests, opposition to Zionism, which is a political ideology. Criticising Israel is not in and of itself anti-Semitic. Imagining different ways of Israel being organised politically or a different form of self-determination is not in and of itself anti-Semitic. Can you talk, given that his kind of commentary there, how does that fit with what you just said about an academic and the debate around Zionism within a university context? Is that anti-Semitic?
Well, I do know David Sluky, and indeed he is working, or his centre is producing some of these training modules,
Great.
Which I'm yet to see in action.
Yeah.
There's absolute truth in what he says. But what we've seen happen in recent times is that the two have bled, but a great deal into each other. Okay, we're not talking about a little drop of blood. Yeah. We're talking about it being almost synonymous, because most Jews in Australia identify with Israel as the Jewish homeland. Not necessarily where they are going to be living, but it is a homeland for the Jewish people. It's been their homeland for thousands of years. They see and understand, and also it is a democratic sovereign nation that was established. And a criticism of Zionism, if it's seen as just a criticism of the government policy, is one thing. But if it's a criticism that moves into the fact that it shouldn't exist, and that's where most of the criticism is. It's a colonial state, it's a racist state, it shouldn't exist. It should just sort of disappear, and those people, those Jews in it, should either be absorbed into one, caliphate in the Middle East or wherever. Maybe they should come back, should all come to Australia. But that should go. Then that is anti-Semitic. So, and I think the New York University in particular has adopted a very clear statement, and this is something that's I want to insert in our statement or see in our statement, that substituting the word Zionist for Jew does not mean that whatever is being said is not anti-Semitic. Yeah. So where Jewish students are called dirty Zios, that is anti-Semitic. By using the word Zio or Zionist, it doesn't remove it from being anti-Semitic because you're not using the word Jew. So and that's where a lot of the hatred and the epithets have been directed. So that is very clearly anti-Semitic. But Zionism as a philosophy, of course, is an academic view of it, is that it's just about the establishment of a state. But because so many Jewish people all over the world, and particularly in Australia, identify with that as their homeland, the homeland of the Jewish people that the people belong to, the Jews here in Australia belong to, in an abstract sense, we have to be very careful that criticism of Israel is actually not stepping over the line.
Yeah, thank you for offering that. I really appreciate you addressing that subtlety, and I think what I heard you say was it's the attachment of a hate speech attached to that idea versus a debate
and an elimination.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the Parliament recognised in the phrase "from the river to the sea," created had the context of the elimination of the state, which is from the river to the sea, and therefore that is anti-Semitic.
Thank you. The second question I just want to ask, and this kind of refers to your work, the discussion we're having today, particularly about universities, but also to your larger role as Special Envoy. You've talked about universities being the first point of call when there is an issue, but do you have a strong opinion about where complaints should go beyond universities? I mean, it has been discussed that the Australian Human Rights Commission, is a place where complaints around racism go, or is it a case that the National Student Ombudsman should have greater powers that they can then exercise? I would really value your thoughts around that question. Who's best placed to consider complaints about allegations of anti-Semitism or racial vilification on university campuses?
Well, I think that, rather like institutions in the community dealing with consumers, banks or telecommunication organisations, the first place that the complaint should go and be dealt with is by the institution itself. Okay? I mean, can't have just external organisations dealing with all complaints. It's up to the institution to be the first line of receiving the complaint, and should be one door into it for all complaints, as Bruce Hodgkinson articulates, and it should be clear, it should be mechanisms to resolve it, and it should be public as to the resolution, even if it's de-identified. Where you need, and so, banks, if you're a disaffected bank customer about something, you complain to the bank, and it has to have a system. And each university should appoint, just like banks have a ombudsman internally, they should have their own, senior person, whatever they call them. If you're not satisfied or you don't feel that you can trust that system, you need to go elsewhere, and that's where I think the student ombudsman is useful and important in relation to, harassment and sexual complaints and anti-Semitic complaints. And that's why I've spoken to the Student Ombudsman's office, and they are very keen that their staff be educated also about anti-Semitism, and they will adopt a definition along the same lines as the universities. And I think that's where that ombudsman, rather like the Commonwealth Ombudsman, generally will resolve it and make public in a report the systemic nature of complaints. I don't think that the Human Rights Commission is a place for individual resolution of complaints in that way. I think, and you've heard that the Jewish community still has a long way to go to re-establish trust in the Human Rights Commission. But I just don't think, for each individual student complaint that it's the right thing. It has an important mechanism in terms of processes when there needs to be litigation like 18C cases, and so it has an important role, but I don't see it as in any way substituting for an ombudsman service.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've gone 15 minutes over time, Special Envoy, but certainly if there are further bits of correspondence or evidence or questions on notice that you wish to provide to the committee, we would certainly welcome it. And if there are any questions on notice taken today, we'd request that they be provided to the committee by close of business 13 December 2024. And can I just say, on behalf of the committee, we certainly really appreciate the work that you're doing alongside universities to try and improve processes, understanding, definitions, and confidence in our university sector by our students. It's certainly appreciated, and good luck. And
thank you. And can I just say, if you have more questions, please feel free, as a result of any other evidence or as you consider the matters, I'd be happy to answer them. And I also think, and I haven't made this point, but that, we're seeing anti-Semitism in the community, as you know, and that's a whole other piece of work that has to be done. There's a sort of feedback loop between community and universities. It's not as if they're in isolation. So we need to, even if we improve situations on universities, we have to deal with it in community as well.
Indeed, and we will do our best to start with universities as per the terms of reference in this committee's deliberations. Yes. Thank you, Ms. Segal. We'll leave you there, and we will now suspend the hearings and return at 1:50 p.m.